On a damp Tuesday evening, when the respectable citizens of Flaxborough preferred to remain indoors with their wireless sets murmuring gently in the background, the parish council assembled in the chilly upstairs room of the town hall to discuss matters of grave civic importance, including the repainting of the bus shelter and whether the vicarage hedge had exceeded its historically appropriate height. The meeting might have proceeded in its usual sedate fashion had it not been for Mrs. Dalloway Finch's cough. Mrs. Finch, treasurer of St. Barnabas Parish Council for 14 conscientious years, was a thin lady whose spectacles rested permanently at the end of her nose, as if in perpetual disappointment. She rose, ledger clasped in her gloved hands, and cleared her throat in a manner suggesting that what she was about to say would be both regrettable and unavoidable. "I regret to inform the council," she began, peering over her lenses with the faint severity of a magistrate, "that there appears to be a discrepancy." The word fell upon the room like a misplaced hymn note. Councillor Bertie Stroud, who owned the ironmongery and considered himself financially literate by virtue of selling padlocks, frowned. Discrepancy how? Mrs. Finch adjusted her grip on the large leather-bound ledger, a volume that had survived 3 vicars, 5 flower shows, and the unfortunate Jubilee bunting incident of '68. A sum of £142 and 8 shillings is unaccounted for. A pause followed. Not a dramatic pause, but one of mild communal bewilderment. "That can't be right," murmured Miss Clarissa Bellamy, chair of the Ladies' Decorative Subcommittee. "We balanced everything after the harvest supper." "So I believed," Mrs. Finch replied stiffly. "Yet the entries do not correspond with the bank statement." The vicar, Reverend Ambrose Pritchard, a kindly man whose sermons tended to wander, leaned forward. "Perhaps it is merely an arithmetic oversight?" Mrs. Finch's lips tightened in a way that suggested arithmetic had never once overshot her expectations. "I have recalculated the totals 3 times," she said. "The sum remains absent." At this point, the word absent began to acquire a weight disproportionate to its modest financial value. £142 might not have alarmed a London borough, but in Flaxborough it represented either 2 modest parish improvements or 1 particularly ambitious tea tent. The meeting dissolved into that peculiar murmur characteristic of small towns confronting potential impropriety. Each councillor began mentally reviewing past expenditures, not out of guilt, but out of an instinctive need to ensure their own minor indulgences, extra biscuits, and additional raffle tickets remained comfortably defensible. By 9 o'clock the matter had been referred, with cautious phrasing, to the local constabulary. Inspector Perbrite received the news the following morning while stirring his tea with slow deliberation. He was not a man given to excitement over financial irregularities. Numbers, in his experience, were rarely dishonest by themselves. It was people who proved unreliable custodians. "A missing parish sum," he repeated mildly, as Sergeant Love relayed the message. How very ambitious. Sergeant Love, earnest and faintly alarmed by any suggestion of impropriety in the ecclesiastical sphere, shifted in his chair. "Shall I attend at once, sir?" Perbrite regarded the rain tracing patient lines down the station window. "We shall both attend." It is, after all, a communal anxiety. One does not leave those unattended. By midday he found himself seated in the same town hall room, the ledger placed before him like a patient awaiting diagnosis. Mrs. Finch hovered nearby, her expression indicating that the book's honour had been personally affronted. Perbrite opened the volume carefully. The pages were neat, each entry recorded in a firm, slightly angular script. He leafed through, noting dates of jumble sales, choir outings, and roof repairs. There was nothing flamboyant about the handwriting. It conveyed duty rather than flourish. "You alone maintain these entries?" he asked, gently. Yes, Inspector, Mrs. Finch replied. I have done so since 1958. And no one else handles the ledger? Only briefly on occasion, she conceded, if I must leave it during meetings. Sergeant Love scribbled this down with disproportionate significance. Purbright traced one finger along a column of figures. The discrepancy, when did you first observe it? Last Thursday evening, during routine reconciliation. And since then? I have examined every receipt. She paused. The bank confirms the balance as lower than expected. Purbright nodded, as if this merely confirmed the ledger's narrative. Outside, word of the missing funds had begun to circulate with notable enthusiasm. At Braithwaite's bakery, customers discussed the matter over currant buns, each adding quiet emphasis to the figure. By afternoon, the sum had grown in certain retellings to £200, and in one ambitious version, nearly £5. Miss Bellamy, meanwhile, confided to her neighbour that Mrs. Finch's rigid accounting style had long alienated volunteers. One cannot even claim postage without scrutiny, she said, which may have reflected more upon Miss Bellamy's relationship with receipts than upon Mrs. Finch's vigilance. Perbrite continued his inspection without visible impatience. He asked about the harvest supper receipts, the allocation for hymn book replacements, and the curious entry labelled miscellaneous floral adjustments. That refers to chrysanthemums, Mrs. Finch said somewhat defensively. They were unseasonably expensive. Flowers can be so, Perbrite agreed solemnly. It was not until he reached the final quarter's entries that he paused. May I inquire, he asked, why this amount is entered in slightly different ink? Mrs. Finch leaned forward. Oh, that was merely the vicar's fountain pen. Mine had run dry. The vicar smiled faintly as though ink substitution were a minor ecumenical act. Purbright closed the ledger gently. I see. There was nothing accusatory in his tone. In fact, he seemed almost apologetic for intruding upon such an orderly volume. We shall, of course, examine the bank records and interview those present at recent meetings, he said. It may yet prove administrative. Mrs. Finch's relief flickered, though she masked it swiftly. The vicar folded his hands, already composing a pastoral reassurance in his mind. As Perbrite and Sergeant Love descended the town hall steps, the inspector paused briefly to observe a small cluster of townspeople pretending not to watch them. Curious thing, money, he remarked softly. It alters the temperature of conversation. Sergeant Love glanced back at the building. Do you think it's theft, sir? Perbrite considered the grey sky, the damp pavement, and the faint echo of Mrs. Finch's measured indignation. I think, he said quietly, that it is unlikely to be arithmetic. And with that understated pronouncement, the first ripple of unease settled gently over Flaxborough, a town which prided itself on balancing both its books and its consciences with equal precision. Purbright did not return to the station at once. He walked instead along the high street at a pace suggesting leisure rather than urgency, though his eyes travelled with quiet attention, window displays, doorways, faces that turned a fraction too quickly away. Flaxborough possessed the practised innocence of a town that believed itself too well-mannered for wrongdoing, which was precisely why any suggestion of it produced such brisk moral activity. At Braithwaite's bakery the bell gave an eager jingle as he entered, and warmth rose to meet him, yeast, sugar, and the faintly medicinal smell of floor polish. Mrs. Braithwaite herself stood behind the counter with the composed expression of a woman who knew every private sorrow in town and considered it an occupational hazard. "Inspector," she said, as if he had come to inquire about a missing loaf rather than missing funds. "A bun?" Perbrite accepted one with mild gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Braithwaite. I've been told it's unwise to investigate parish affairs on an empty stomach." "Well, you'll find more than parish affairs in that lot," she replied, wrapping the bun as though she were bandaging a wound. "It's the ledger today. It'll be the vicar's conscience tomorrow." Behind him, two women at the small table near the window fell abruptly silent, their teacups midway to their lips. Their silence had the anxious stiffness of people who wish to appear uninterested while remaining fully informed. Purbright seated himself without invitation, as if the bakery were an extension of his office, and began to eat in a manner that discouraged haste. Mrs. Braithwaite leaned in slightly. "Now," she said, lowering her voice by half a tone, "is it true the money's been taken?" "It is true," Perbrite replied, "that the bank statement and the parish entries do not agree." Mrs. Braithwaite looked faintly disappointed. "That's not as interesting." "It usually isn't," he said, and allowed a pause in which the two women behind him strained politely to hear. "Who has been talking most about it?" "Everyone," she said. "But Miss Bellamy's been particularly busy. She was in here yesterday, saying if the treasurer had been less rigid, people wouldn't feel tempted." "Tempted," Perbrite repeated, tasting the word as carefully as the currants. Mrs. Braithwaite shrugged. "It's what people say when they mean someone else did it. Miss Bellamy never liked Mrs. Finch, you see. Not since she refused to reimburse her for those emergency ribbons at the flower show. Clarissa took it as a personal slight, though I imagine it was mostly an accounting one." Purbright thanked her and rose, leaving precisely the cost of the bun on the counter, as he were paying not for food, but for permission to listen. Outside, the rain had thinned to a persistent mist. He walked a few doors down to the parish office, a narrow building that looked as though it disapproved of modernity. Reverend Pritchard met him in the doorway, looking mildly harassed, the way a man looks when he has misplaced his umbrella and discovered at the same time that human nature is unreliable. "Inspector," the vicar said, smiling too quickly, "I was just about to call you." Perbrite stepped inside and observed the office with the innocent interest of a visitor to a museum stacked hymnals, a faint smell of damp paper, a coat stand that had seen better decades. On the desk lay a thin pile of receipts arranged with the sort of anxious neatness that suggested someone had been trying to make disorder look respectable. "I wondered," Perbrite said gently, "if I might see the bank statements myself." "Of course," Pritchard replied, and reached for a folder as though it, might bite him. "It's all here," Mrs. Finch insisted. In the vicar's mind, the folder represented a moral test he had not applied for. He liked people. He assumed, by instinct and training, that they meant well, yet he had begun to suspect that good intentions made very poor locks. Purbright leafed through the statements. The totals were modest, the transactions familiar: hall hire, candle purchases, roof repairs, a payment to a supplier for floral adjustments. Then he paused at a withdrawal cash in a neat hand, dated a fortnight before the harvest supper. "Who made this withdrawal?" he asked, not looking up. The vicar's face coloured faintly. "I did," he said. "Mrs. Finch asked me. She was unwell that morning and said it would save her the trouble." "And the cash was used for what purpose?" "For supper. Certain things had to be paid for immediately: the butcher, the tea-urn hire, that sort of thing." Pritchard smiled again, but it was the smile of a man trying to keep a raft steady in a slow leak. "And the receipts?" "They were handed to Mrs. Finch," he said quickly. "All of them. She's meticulous." Purbright nodded, as if nothing could be more ordinary than a clergyman collecting cash for sausages. "Who else has access to these statements?" "Only me," Pritchard admitted, "and occasionally Miss Bellamy when she helps with correspondence." Miss Bellamy's name drifted into the room like perfume, pleasant at first, then slightly cloying. Perbrite made a small note, though his pencil moved with such calm that it seemed merely to be stretching. At the station later, Sergeant Love had already compiled a list of parish meeting attendees volunteers, and recent committee quarrels. He looked up eagerly as Purbright entered. "Sir," he said, "people are saying Mrs. Finch could have well misplaced it, or taken it and forgotten. Some are saying her eyesight isn't what it was." Perbrite removed his wet hat and placed it carefully on the peg, as though the hat deserved dignity, even if gossip did not. "Mrs. Finch's eyesight," he said, "is keen enough to spot an unclaimed penny in a collection tin. If she had taken money, she would have recorded it twice and initialized it for emphasis." Sergeant Love blinked, uncertain whether this was humor or deduction. Purbright sat at his desk and began arranging the papers with deliberate quiet. In his mind, the image of the ledger returned its neat columns, its sudden change of ink, the small indignity of an entry written by another hand. He thought, too, of the vicar's embarrassment, not at wrongdoing, but at proximity to it. Outside the station window, two townsmen paused, glanced in, and walked on. Flaxborough, he knew, was already dividing itself into those who felt threatened and those who felt superior. He looked up at Sergeant Love. "We'll speak to Miss Bellamy," he said, "and to the bank manager, and then perhaps to Mrs. Finch again, only this time not about numbers." Love straightened. "About what then, sir?" Purbright's expression remained mild, almost courteous. "About habits," he said. "People keep their secrets where they keep their routines." And in that quiet, unhurried way, the inquiry edged forward, not with sirens or sudden raids, but with the steady pressure of polite attention that in Flaxborough could feel far more alarming than force. Miss Clarissa Bellamy received Inspector Purbright in the drawing-room of her semi-detached villa with the air of a woman accustomed to presiding over committees and floral arrangements in equal measure. The room was tastefully assertive, lace antimacassars, framed photographs of prize-winning dahlias, and a piano that had not been opened since optimism was fashionable. "I do hope this won't take long, Inspector," she said, seating herself opposite him with a posture suggesting she had nothing whatsoever to conceal. "The Spring Fete Subcommittee meets at 4. I shall endeavour not to delay civic progress," Perbrite replied pleasantly. Sergeant Love occupied the edge of a brocaded chair, notebook poised with reverence. Miss Bellamy's gaze flicked briefly to him, assessing him as she might be, a new volunteer, useful perhaps, but in need of guidance. "I understand," Perbrite began, "that you occasionally assist Reverend Pritchard with parish correspondence." "Oh, frequently," she said. "The poor man is hopeless with administrative niceties. One must ensure things are phrased correctly." "And have you ever handled the parish ledger?" Her lips tightened. "Only in passing. Mrs. Finch guards it as though it were the crown jewels." "Yet you were present at the harvest supper preparations," Perbrite observed. "Of course. I oversaw decorations and raffle coordination. Without me, the entire event would have resembled a jumble sale." Perbrite inclined his head as though this were a measurable calamity. "And were you aware of any irregularity at that time?" "Certainly not," she replied swiftly, "though I will say, if you permit, candor, that Mrs. Finch's rigidity can be provocative. Provocative in what sense? She insists on receipts for everything, even postage stamps. It creates an atmosphere of mistrust." Miss Bellamy folded her hands, satisfied with the moral symmetry of her statement. Perbrite studied her face with polite interest. Her indignation was not theatrical. It had the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed it privately. On the mantelpiece stood a framed certificate for outstanding parish contribution, 1971, bearing her name in ornamental script. And yet, he said mildly, such vigilance would seem designed precisely to prevent discrepancies. "Or to conceal them," she returned, the words escaping with surprising firmness. Sergeant Love's pencil scratched audibly. Perbrite allowed a brief silence. Do you believe Mrs. Finch capable of dishonesty? Miss Bellamy hesitated. It was not a pause of doubt, but of calculation. I believe, she said carefully, that long stewardship breeds opportunity. Opportunity, Purbright echoed. Yes. When one controls the figures, one controls the narrative. Perbrite smiled faintly. That is an interesting formulation. He rose soon after, thanking her for her cooperation. As they stepped back onto the damp pavement, Sergeant Love exhaled. She's certain it's Mrs. Finch, he said. Certainty, Perbrite replied, is often more revealing than evidence. They proceeded next to the modest branch of the county bank, where Mr. Harold Preece, manager for 18 dutiful years, received them with the solemnity of a man who regarded account balances as extensions of character. I can confirm the withdrawal, Preece said, adjusting his cuffs. Reverend Pritchard presented proper identification. The funds were dispersed without irregularity. And have there been any unusual transactions beyond that? Perbrite asked. None, Preece replied promptly. The parish account is exemplary, small but tidy. Tidy, Perbrite repeated thoughtfully. Back at the station, he laid the bank statement beside a copy of the ledger entry Mrs. Finch had provided. The amounts corresponded precisely. The withdrawal was recorded in the ledger entered in the vicar's ink, as previously noted. Yet the subsequent distribution of cash at the harvest supper appeared slightly less precise, rounded figures where one might expect exactitude. Sergeant Love leaned over his shoulder. It could be a simple miscalculation, sir. Indeed, Perbrite said, yet Mrs. Finch does not appear to favour rounding. He tapped the page lightly. Notice here the reimbursement for floral supplies. The receipt indicates £112. The ledger records 120. Love frowned. That's an £8 difference, which, when added to several other modest discrepancies, approaches our missing sum. Love's eyes widened. Then someone inflated the figures? Or misread them, Perbrite said calmly. But Mrs. Finch's handwriting is exact. The overstatement occurs only in entries written in the vicar's pen. They sat with that observation for a moment. Outside, the town clock struck 3, each chime settling over Flaxborough, like a reminder that time, unlike money, could not be misplaced. "Shall we confront the vicar?" Love asked. Purbright shook his head. "Not yet. A man who believes himself helpful can be more defensive than a thief." He rose and crossed to the window, watching as Miss Bellamy hurried past, her expression brisk, purposeful. In her mind, the investigation had already achieved a shape convenient to her grievances. Purbright, however, was less interested in grievance than in habit. He recalled the vicar's mild embarrassment, Mrs. Finch's wounded precision, Miss Bellamy's controlled indignation. Each carried a fragment of unease, but none yet formed a whole. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I would like to examine the original harvest supper receipts, everyone, and I would like to know precisely who handled the cash that evening." Love nodded eagerly. Purbright turned back to the desk, gathering the papers with unhurried care. The figures did not accuse, they merely suggested, but in their small, consistent deviations lay something more human than arithmetic. A preference, perhaps, or an adjustment made not for gain alone, but for pride. And as the afternoon light thinned over the station yard, the inquiry advanced another careful inch, not towards accusation, but towards understanding the subtle economies of reputation that governed Flaxborough far more tightly than any ledger ever could. The following morning dawned with a damp brightness that Flaxborough regarded as optimistic. Inspector Perbrite arrived at the parish office shortly after 9, where the harvest supper receipts had been assembled in a shallow cardboard box that looked faintly embarrassed by its contents. Mrs. Finch stood beside the desk, arms folded, spectacles perched with renewed severity. She had clearly slept poorly, though she would never admit to such a lapse in discipline. "I have arranged them chronologically," she said, indicating the box as one might present evidence in a civil dispute. Purbright thanked her and began sorting through the slips of paper with deliberate care. There were butcher's invoices, bakery chits, tea-urn hire confirmations, and the inevitable handwritten note from a parishioner who preferred reimbursement in coin rather than cheque. The figures were modest, the handwriting varied, but one pattern persisted. The amounts entered into the ledger occasionally exceeded those on the receipts. "Who tallied the final totals on the evening itself?" he asked, without looking up. "I did," Mrs. Finch replied, "though I was unwell for part of the morning preparations. The vicar kindly withdrew the cash. And during supper? The takings were collected by volunteers and handed to me at intervals." Her expression tightened. Miss Bellamy oversaw the raffle table. Perbrite made a small note. "Did she handle any receipts?" "Only those related to decorations," Mrs. Finch said. "She insisted on managing that herself." There was a faint but unmistakable emphasis on insisted. Sergeant Love, who had been quietly examining a cluster of smaller receipts, looked up. "Sir, here's one for floral supplies, £112. Purbright took it and compared it to the ledger copy. "Entered as 120, he murmured. Mrs. Finch leaned closer, her indignation rekindling. "I would not make such an error." "I do not believe you would," Perbrite said gently. The vicar arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by a note left at the vicarage door. He appeared apologetic before any accusation had been made. "I fear this has become quite the spectacle," he said, wringing his hat gently. "Several parishioners have written to express concern." "Concern for the funds?" Perbrite asked, "or for their own names?" The vicar hesitated. "Both, I think." Perbrite spread the receipts on the desk. "Reverend, when you recorded the withdrawal in the ledger, did you also assist with subsequent entries?" "Only if Mrs. Finch asked," he said quickly. "My pen was available." "And did you ever total the floral expenses yourself?" "I may have copied figures if she dictated them," he admitted. "I'm afraid numbers are not my strong suit." It was an admission delivered with almost pastoral humility. Sergeant Love shifted, uncertain whether incompetence constituted guilt. By midday, word of the inspector's continued presence at the parish office had drawn an informal audience across the street. Councillor Stroud was among them, hands thrust into his coat pockets with proprietary concern. When invited inside, Stroud wasted no time. "Inspector, the town cannot endure prolonged suspicion. It damages confidence. If Mrs. Finch has made an error, we must address it discreetly." Purbright regarded him with mild interest. "You are certain it is Mrs. Finch? Well, she controls the ledger," Stroud said. "Opportunity, as Miss Bellamy put it." Purbright allowed a brief silence. "Opportunity is rarely so solitary." Stroud flushed slightly. "Are you suggesting wider impropriety?" "I am suggesting," Purbright replied evenly, "that arithmetic should not be convicted before testimony." The councillor departed with visible discomfort, and the room seemed to exhale. As the afternoon lengthened, Purbright requested one further item: the petty cash tin used during the harvest supper. It was produced from a cupboard with faint reluctance. Inside lay only a handful of coins and a folded raffle ticket stub. Purbright examined the tin's interior. "Was this ever left unattended?" Mrs. Finch bristled. "Certainly not. Though during the raffle drawing several volunteers were present." "Miss Bellamy among them?" "Yes." The vicar cleared his throat. "Clarissa is devoted to parish affairs." "Devotion," Purbright said softly, "can take many forms." He closed the tin and replaced it carefully. The pieces were arranging themselves, though not yet coherently. The inflated figures in the vicar's ink, the floral receipts managed independently, the subtle campaign against Mrs. Finch's reputation all suggested a narrative being shaped alongside the accounts. As they prepared to leave, Sergeant Love spoke in a low voice. "Sir, if the entries were inflated intentionally, it would make Mrs. Finch appear negligent," Purbright replied. "And if the town believes she erred, then the person responsible stands beyond suspicion," Perbrite finished. Outside, Miss Bellamy crossed the square, pausing briefly when she noticed Perbrite watching her. She offered a polite smile, composed, untroubled, entirely confident. Perbrite returned the gesture with equal civility. The investigation had not yet named its culprit, but it had begun to recognize a pattern. Small exaggerations, carefully placed, a readiness to assign blame, an eagerness to tidy matters swiftly. In Flaxborough, reputation was currency, and sometimes the most efficient way to enrich oneself was not by stealing money, but by redistributing trust. As the inspector and his sergeant walked back toward the station, the town resumed its quiet routines. Shopkeepers adjusted displays, curtains twitched, conversations resumed mid-sentence. And somewhere within those routines, Perbrite suspected, lay not merely the missing sum, but the motive for its disappearance, an adjustment made not for profit alone, but for position. Inspector Purbright did not immediately share his reflections with Sergeant Love upon returning to the station. Instead, he placed the harvest supper receipts in a careful row across his desk and regarded them as one might regard parishioners after a particularly candid sermon, aware that each concealed more than it confessed. Love waited with visible restraint. "Sir," he ventured at last, "if the entries were inflated to cast doubt on Mrs. Finch, it would require access both to the receipts and the ledger." "Quite so," Perbrite replied, "and access, in Flaxborough, is seldom accidental." He lifted the floral supplier's receipt once more. The paper bore the name of Clegg and Daughters, Florists, in an earnest green ink. The total £112 was plainly written. Below it, in a different pen, a faint notation read, "Paid in cash, C.B." Love leaned forward. "C.B., that would be Miss Bellamy." "Indeed." Perbrite turned the receipt slightly, observed the fold. It had been creased twice across its centre, then smoothed, not unusual in itself. But the crease did not align with the size of the petty cash tin in which such receipts were ordinarily stored. "This was kept separately," Perbrite said, "not in the tin." Love considered this. "Perhaps in a handbag, or a file," Perbrite suggested, "or somewhere it might be consulted later." He rose and reached for his coat. "Let us pay a call on Clegg and Daughters." The florist's shop occupied a narrow corner of the high street, its window dressed with chrysanthemums of improbable optimism. Miss Agnes Clegg, eldest daughter and bookkeeper, greeted them with polite apprehension. "Inspector? Is something amiss with the parish arrangement?" she asked, glancing instinctively at a display of lilies as though they might be culpable. "Merely a clarification," Perbrite assured her. "The harvest supper order. Do you recall who placed it?" Miss Clegg consulted a ledger of her own. Miss Bellamy did. She specified particular colours, quite particular. "And the payment?" "In cash, on delivery." She tapped the page. £112, exactly." "Exactly?" Perbrite echoed. "We do not round," she said primly. Love shifted, sensing the quiet symmetry between florists and treasurers. "Did Miss Bellamy discuss parish accounts with you?" Perbrite asked. "Only to remark that budgets can be restrictive," Miss Clegg said, choosing the word with care. She suggested that excellence requires flexibility. Perbrite inclined his head. "Flexibility is often expensive." Outside again, the high street hummed with subdued normality. Love looked troubled. Sir, if Miss Bellamy paid 112, but the ledger shows 120, then someone altered the figure before or during its recording, Purbright finished. And since Mrs. Finch's hand is absent from that entry, we must ask who benefited from the excess. They returned to the station where Perbrite laid out the receipts anew. The discrepancies, when added together, totalled £142 and 8 shillings, the exact missing sum. The inflation had not been random. It had been precise. Sir, Love said slowly, that would mean the money was never missing from the supper takings. It was siphoned through the accounts. An elegant method, Perbrite agreed, one which creates the appearance of carelessness rather than theft. He sat back, fingers steepled lightly. Consider also the narrative emerging in town. Mrs. Finch is overbearing guardian of funds, Mrs. Finch as potential miser, Mrs. Finch as suspect. Reputation softens resistance. Love nodded. If she were removed as treasurer, someone else might take the role. Perbrite's gaze drifted toward the window, where Miss Bellamy's villa could just be glimpsed beyond the rooftops. A more flexible steward, he murmured. Late that afternoon, a small but telling incident occurred. Mrs. Finch arrived at the station unannounced, her composure visibly frayed. "I have been advised," she said stiffly, "that I should consider stepping down for the good of the parish." "Advised by whom?" Perbrite asked gently. "Miss Bellamy, among others. She feels that fresh oversight might restore confidence." Perbrite regarded her kindly. "And do you agree?" Her lips trembled not with guilt, but with wounded pride. "I have given 14 years to that ledger. I would not steal from it." "I am aware," he said quietly. As she departed, Love looked indignant. "They're pushing her out, sir?" Which, Perbrite replied, would neatly conclude matters. He rose and paced once across the small office, then returned to the desk with renewed deliberation. "There is one small detail yet unaccounted for," he said. "The vicar's ink." Love blinked. "Sir?" "The entries inflated are written in his pen, but not necessarily by his hand. A fountain pen can be borrowed without ceremony." Love's eyes widened. "If one wished to create the impression that the vicar merely copied figures inaccurately," Perbrite continued, "one might ensure the ink supported that illusion." He closed the ledger copy with quiet finality. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall invite Miss Bellamy to assist us in reviewing the accounts, publicly, in the presence of those most eager for resolution." Love's expression brightened. "A test, sir." "A clarification," Perbrite corrected softly. Outside, evening settled over Flaxborough with habitual calm. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn, conversations lowered. Yet, beneath that routine lay a subtle tremor, the awareness that numbers, once examined too closely, can expose more than arithmetic. And Inspector Purbright, patient as ever, prepared to apply one final polite pressure where adjustment had quietly replaced honesty. Inspector Purbright's invitation to review the parish accounts was extended with such courteous neutrality that no one could reasonably decline. By early afternoon the following day, the town hall's upper room was once again occupied not by indignant murmurs this time, but by a carefully assembled circle of concerned respectability. Mrs. Finch sat upright at one end of the table, ledger before her like a shield restored to service. Reverend Pritchard occupied the adjacent chair, hands folded with clerical resignation. Councillor Stroud stood near the window, his presence suggesting oversight rather than interference. Miss Bellamy arrived precisely on time, carrying a slim leather folder and an expression of brisk cooperation. "Inspector," she said lightly, "I understand you wish to clarify matters." "Indeed," Perbrite replied. "Transparency tends to steady the pulse. Sergeant Love distributed copies of the relevant receipts. The atmosphere was civil, almost studious, though beneath it ran a faint current of anticipation. Flaxborough had gathered not merely to examine figures, but to witness vindication, though whose vindication remained politely unstated. Purbright began without ceremony. "We have identified several instances," he said calmly, "in which figures recorded in the ledger exceed those on the original receipts. The total of these differences corresponds precisely to the amount presently unaccounted for." Miss Bellamy's eyebrows lifted with theatrical concern. "Then the error is clear." "Perhaps," Perbrite agreed. "Yet the origin of that error remains of interest." He turned to the floral receipt. "Miss Clegg confirms payment of £112. The ledger records 120. Reverend Pritchard's pen was used to enter the figure." The vicar shifted uneasily. "I may have misheard the amount," he said. Perbrite inclined his head. "An understandable possibility, yet the same pattern appears across multiple entries, always in similar increments, and always relating to expenses overseen by one individual." There was a perceptible tightening around the table. Miss Bellamy folded her hands. "Are you implying incompetence?" "I am implying," Perbrite said gently, "that consistency is rarely accidental." He placed before them a small blotting paper retrieved from the vicar's desk. Its surface bore faint impressions of numerals figures written recently in his ink. When held at an angle, the sequence became legible: 112 altered to 120, 34 to 40, 58 to 65. The room fell into a quiet that was no longer puzzled, but attentive. "These impressions," Perbrite continued, "were made not in the ledger, but upon loose receipts before transcription." Miss Bellamy's composure flickered, though only slightly. "Surely anyone might have used the vicar's pen." "Quite so," Perbrite replied, "which is why we examined handwriting. Sergeant Love produced a comparative sheet. The altered numerals, when isolated from the ledger, bore a faint, stylistic resemblance to Miss Bellamy's careful script, particularly in the curved top of the numeral 2 and the precise cross of the 7. Mrs. Finch's breath caught softly. "This does not prove," Miss Bellamy began. "No," Perbrite said calmly, "but it aligns with motive." He allowed the word to rest, neither accusing nor theatrical. "Mrs. Finch's tenure as treasurer has not been universally admired," he continued. "Her precision has occasioned discomfort. A small erosion of confidence might prompt calls for new oversight." Councillor Stroud cleared his throat, suddenly aware of his earlier suggestions. Miss Bellamy's expression hardened, though her voice remained measured. "You suggest I inflated minor figures to discredit Mrs. Finch? For what gain? The sums are trivial." "Indeed," Perbrite agreed, "trivial sums can produce significant reputational effects, particularly when discovered by the very person whose stewardship is questioned." The vicar looked stricken. "Clarissa." She rose abruptly. "This is absurd. I merely assisted where needed." "By retaining certain receipts briefly?" Perbrite asked quietly. "By adjusting figures before dictation? By ensuring the vicar's pen authenticated them?" Her silence this time was longer. The room, which had once buzzed with communal certainty, now seemed to contract around her. "I intended," she said at last, her tone shifting from indignation to brittle defensiveness, "to introduce flexibility. Mrs. Finch's rigidity stifled progress. The parish requires vision, not bookkeeping, and vision," Perbrite said softly, "is seldom funded by distortion." Mrs. Finch stared at her former colleague with wounded astonishment. "You would have me removed?" "For the good of the parish," Miss Bellamy replied automatically, then faltered. The vicar pressed his hands together as though in prayer for arithmetic. Purbright did not raise his voice. The funds themselves were diverted gradually, concealed within inflated reimbursements. The total matches our discrepancy precisely. Whether restitution is immediate or formal charges are pursued will depend upon your candour. Miss Bellamy's composure dissolved in stages rather than collapse. Pride gave way to calculation, calculation to reluctant recognition. "I did not think it would grow so large," she said quietly. "It was merely an adjustment." "In Flaxborough," Perbrite replied, "adjustments tend to accumulate." The circle around the table felt suddenly less like an audience and more like witnesses not to scandal, but to the delicate mechanics of ambition. Outside, townspeople lingered, unaware that resolution was already forming within the walls. Sergeant Love watched his inspector with renewed respect. There had been no dramatic accusation, no raised tone, only the steady assembly of detail until denial seemed impolite. As the meeting dispersed in subdued murmurs, Purbright gathered the receipts once more. The matter was not yet concluded, formalities remained, but the essential truth had surfaced not through force, but through the quiet pressure of consistency. And in that unremarkable room, beneath the framed minutes of previous meetings, Flaxborough's carefully balanced accounts had finally begun to reconcile, not merely in pounds and shillings, but in reputation and consequence. The subdued dispersal from the town hall did not, as some had optimistically hoped, conclude the matter. If anything, it altered its character. Flaxborough, having braced itself for the exposure of a villain, now found itself confronting something more uncomfortable, motive wrapped in propriety. Miss Bellamy did not return home immediately after the meeting. Instead, she walked briskly across the square, her posture composed but her pace betraying urgency. Those who observed her noted the absence of her customary pause at Braithwaite's window. The omission was remarked upon with quiet interest. Inspector Perbrite, meanwhile, returned to the station with Sergeant Love and placed the collected receipts in a sealed envelope. His manner remained unhurried, though Love sensed a residual tension. "Sir," Love ventured, "do you believe she will repay the sum?" "She will attempt to," Perbrite replied, "but repayment does not restore sequence, only trust does that." Before further speculation could take shape, the station telephone rang with an insistence uncommon for a Friday afternoon. Love answered, listened, and covered the receiver with his palm. "It's Mrs. Finch, sir. She says there's been another irregularity." Perbrite took the call. Mrs. Finch's voice, usually measured, carried a note of controlled alarm. "Inspector, I have just reviewed the parish cupboard. The petty cash tin is missing." "Missing entirely?" he asked. "Yes, it was there yesterday." Purbright replaced the receiver without visible surprise. "We shall attend at once." The town hall room felt altered upon their return, not merely by the absence of Miss Bellamy, but by the faint disorder of objects recently disturbed. The cupboard door hung slightly ajar. The petty cash tin previously restored was indeed gone. Mrs. Finch stood near the desk, pale but resolute. "I locked the cupboard before leaving." "Who retains keys?" Purbright asked. "The vicar and myself," she replied, "and Miss Bellamy temporarily, when assisting with decorations." Sergeant Love examined the cupboard's lock. There were no signs of forced entry. The mechanism yielded obediently to Mrs. Finch's key. Reverend Pritchard arrived shortly thereafter, summoned again, his expression now burdened with something heavier than embarrassment. "Clarissa has not returned my calls," he said quietly. Purbright surveyed the room. The ledger remained on the table, open to the disputed entries, as though the building itself were unwilling to close the chapter prematurely. "A missing tin," Love said under his breath, "after yesterday's meeting." "An unfortunate coincidence," Purbright murmured. He crossed to the window and looked down at the square. A small cluster of townspeople lingered once more, their presence now tinged with anticipation rather than curiosity. News travelled quickly in Flaxborough. Disappearance bred narrative. It may be, Mrs. Finch said stiffly, that Miss Bellamy has taken it to reconcile matters privately. Purbright turned, or to obscure them. The vicar's shoulders sagged. Surely she would not compound error with folly. Ambition rarely consults arithmetic, Perbrite replied gently. They conducted a brief but thorough search of the adjoining rooms. In a narrow corridor leading to the vestry, Love noticed a faint metallic sound beneath a bench. Kneeling, he retrieved the petty cash tin. It was empty, not merely short of coins, but entirely cleared, save for a single folded paper tucked inside. Purbright unfolded it. The note was brief, written in Miss Bellamy's careful script. For parish improvement, adjust as necessary. Love started. She's mocking us. Not mocking, Purbright corrected softly. Justifying, Mrs. Finch pressed a hand to her mouth. The audacity. The vicar looked stricken as though moral arithmetic had exceeded his training. Perbrite examined the tin's interior. There were faint scratches along its base, recent and hurried. He closed it gently. This changes the matter, Love said. It clarifies it, Perbrite replied. Outside, the square had grown subtly animated. A messenger boy hurried past, whispering to a shopkeeper. Curtains shifted. Flaxborough sensed escalation. Sir, Love said, lowering his voice, if she intended to repay the original sum, why remove the tin to control the narrative? Perbrite answered. Yesterday, she was confronted. Today she seeks to redefine the issue not as misappropriation, but as reform. He turned to Mrs. Finch. Has any parish initiative recently been proposed that required additional funds? She hesitated. Miss Bellamy advocated for refurbishment of the community hall stage. It was deemed premature. Premature, Perbrite echoed. Reverend Pritchard closed his eyes briefly. She said the town lacked imagination. Perbrite placed the note back inside the tin. The pattern was no longer merely reputational. It had advanced to action, an attempt to convert exposure into principle. Sergeant, he said calmly, we shall visit Miss Bellamy's residence. As they stepped into the square, the onlookers parted with polite discretion. The air felt sharper now, the town's composure thinning. Miss Bellamy's villa stood with habitual neatness, curtains drawn, but not tightly. When Perbrite knocked, there was a delay longer than courtesy required. At last the door opened. She stood composed, though her eyes betrayed sleepless calculation. Inspector, she said evenly, have you come to discuss parish improvement? Perbrite met her gaze without hostility. No, he replied. We have come to discuss adjustment. And in that measured exchange, the inquiry entered its next phase, not of suspicion, but of consequence, where justification must confront its own arithmetic. Miss Bellamy did not immediately invite them in, but neither did she attempt to close the door. The hesitation was slight, no more than a breath, but in Flaxborough, such measures were often more revealing than confessions. I assume, she said evenly, that this concerns the theatrical ambitions of St. Barnabas. It concerns the petty cash tin, Perbrite replied, his tone uninflected, which appears to have embarked upon an independent errand. A faint tightening crossed her expression. Then you have found it. We have, he said, empty, though not silent. She stepped aside at last, allowing them into the drawing-room where the piano remained resolutely unopened. The leather folder she had carried to the town hall lay on a side table, its presence no longer merely administrative, but anticipatory. Sergeant Love remained standing. Perbrite accepted the offered chair with deliberate calm. You believe, Miss Bellamy began before they could speak, that I had stolen from the parish. I believe, Perbrite said gently, that you have reallocated. She gave a brief humorless laugh. Such a quaint word. Yes, I removed the tin. I intended to consolidate matters. Consolidate? Love echoed before he could prevent himself. She ignored him. The funds were stagnant. The hall stage requires repair. The children's pageant suffers every year from inadequate lighting. Mrs. Finch's parsimony has suffocated progress. Parsimony? Purbright repeated softly, as though considering the weight of the syllables. I inflated minor expenses, she said, her voice steadying as if by admission alone. She reclaimed moral footing, only enough to accumulate what was necessary. The town requires leadership. And you proposed to supply it, Perbrite observed. Yes. There was no hysteria in her tone, only conviction, sharpened by wounded pride. In her mind, the adjustment had been corrective, even visionary. That it contravened arithmetic seemed to her a lesser sin than inertia. The note in the tin, Perbrite said, producing it calmly, suggests that you regard the funds as discretionary. They were always discretionary, she replied, allocated by those without imagination. Love shifted again, discomforted less by the confession than by the clarity of her belief. Perbrite regarded her for a long moment. You did not, I think, anticipate exposure so swiftly. Her composure faltered briefly. Mrs. Finch was expected to resign. It would have resolved matters quietly. And when that did not occur, she glanced toward the leather folder. I intended to present a proposal. With funds already secured, resistance would diminish. Secured, Perbrite repeated. Silence settled, not accusatory, but inevitable. Outside, the muted sounds of the high street continued: cartwheels, distant conversation, the rhythm of a town unaware that its moral scaffolding was under quiet examination. Do you understand, Perbrite said at last, that what you describe as initiative constitutes misappropriation? Her chin lifted. If I had succeeded, it would have been praised as foresight. Success, he replied gently, does not alter definition. For the first time, something like doubt crossed her face, not doubt of her aim, but of her method. I meant no personal gain, she said more quietly. I do not doubt that, Perbrite answered, but public funds do not bend toward private vision without consequence. Love stepped forward slightly. Miss Bellamy, the total removed from the accounts corresponds exactly to the inflated entries. The petty cash tin's contents would have supplemented that sum. She closed her eyes briefly, as though confronted not by accusation but by arithmetic she could no longer rearrange. And Mrs. Finch? She asked suddenly. Will she resume as treasurer, triumphant? That depends upon her willingness, Perbrite replied. Trust, once adjusted, requires careful rebalancing. There was a faint tremor in her hands now, though her voice remained controlled. What happens next? That depends upon your candor, Perbrite said. Restitution is possible. Formal charge is also possible. The parish council will be informed. She drew a breath that seemed to release more pride than air. The funds are in the folder, she said at last, nodding toward the leather case. All but a small portion already committed to lighting estimates. Love opened the folder carefully. Inside lay neatly counted notes and a typed proposal for parish cultural enhancement. Perbrite regarded the document without irony. You prepared this in anticipation of persuasion. Yes, and believed. Persuasion easier once funds were irretrievable. She did not answer. The quiet in the room was no longer tense, but reflective. In Miss Bellamy's mind, the narrative she had constructed of reform thwarted by caution was collapsing into something less heroic. Perbrite rose. You will accompany us to the station, he said, not harshly. A statement will be taken. She stood as well, smoothing her skirt with habitual composure. I suppose, she said with a faint, brittle smile, that the children's pageant must remain dim. Perhaps, Perbrite replied. It may benefit from clearer accounting. As they stepped outside, the square seemed to hold its breath. Curtains parted, conversation paused. Flaxborough sensed that adjustment had reached its limit, and though the sums involved were modest, the implications were not. In seeking to elevate herself above arithmetic, Miss Bellamy had unsettled not merely the ledger, but the quiet contract upon which the town's respectability rested. Miss Bellamy's walk across the square toward the station was conducted under the discreet scrutiny of half the town. No one stared directly. Flaxborough prided itself on civility. Yet curtains parted by fractions and the bell above Braithwaite's door chimed more frequently than custom required. Inspector Purbright did not hurry her. He matched her pace with an almost conversational steadiness, as though escorting her to a committee meeting rather than to provide a statement. At the station, Sergeant Love prepared the small interview room with careful efficiency. The leather folder containing the recovered notes lay on the table, its edges aligned with procedural precision. Miss Bellamy seated herself without prompting, hands folded, expression controlled. "I wish," she said, before any formalities began, "to make it clear that I acted for the parish." Purbright removed his hat and placed it on the peg. "Your clarity is appreciated," he replied. "Motivation will be recorded." The statement proceeded methodically. She admitted to inflating figures prior to dictation, to using the vicar's pen deliberately, and to retaining select receipts briefly before passing them on. Her tone was neither hysterical nor repentant. Rather, it bore the quiet insistence of someone who believed history would eventually vindicate her. When the formal portion concluded, Perbrite closed the notebook and regarded her thoughtfully. "There is one matter yet unresolved," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The lighting estimates?" "No," he said. "Timing." She waited. "You began adjusting figures several weeks before the harvest supper," he continued. "Small increments at first. £8 here, 7 there. What prompted the initial alteration?" A faint crease appeared between her brows. "It was necessary." "Necessary," he repeated gently. "But what occasioned the necessity?" She hesitated. For the first time, her composure faltered not from exposure but from recollection. "There was a meeting," she said slowly. "Mrs. Finch refused reimbursement for certain preliminary stage sketches. She called them speculative. And you disagreed. I believe preparation deserved encouragement." Purbright nodded. "So the first adjustment occurred shortly after that meeting?" "Yes. And the second?" "When Councillor Stroud dismissed the proposal as premature." Love glanced up, startled by the admission's simplicity. "You perceived resistance," Purbright said, "and resolved to outpace it." Her lips pressed together. "I resolved to act." The inspector's voice remained mild. "Did it occur to you that persuasion, rather than substitution, might have served?" She gave a short breath of weary impatience. "Flaxborough does not respond to persuasion. It responds to accomplished facts." "An interesting assessment," he said. Silence settled once more, but this time it carried reflection rather than tension. Outside, the town resumed its rhythmic delivery carts, distant laughter, and the measured toll of the church clock. "Miss Bellamy," Perbrite said at last, "do you regret the act?" She did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the window, as though she could see beyond the brick walls to the square she had once crossed with assured authority. "I regret," she said finally, "that Mrs. Finch proved less fragile than anticipated." Love shifted sharply, but Purbright's expression did not alter. "Then you do not regret the appropriation itself?" She met his eyes. "I regret being discovered before completion. It was not bravado, it was candour stripped of ornament." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "Thank you." He rose, signalling the close of the interview. Formal charges would be considered in consultation with the parish council. Restitution was already secured, the petty cash tin would be restored, yet the matter extended beyond currency. As Miss Bellamy was escorted to a waiting office, Love spoke quietly. "Sir, she doesn't see it as theft." "No, Purbright," replied. "She sees it as a correction. And that makes it harder? It makes it human." He returned to his desk and began drafting a brief memorandum for the council. His language was measured, precise, devoid of drama. Figures were enumerated, sequence established, confession noted. Later that afternoon, Reverend Pritchard arrived, hat in hand, eyes shadowed. "I cannot pretend," the vicar said softly, "that I foresaw this." "Few do," Perbrite answered. "She believed herself a benefactor." "Many do." The vicar sighed. "What shall become of her?" "That," Perbrite said gently, "will depend upon how the parish balances justice with mercy." As evening approached, the news began its inevitable circulation. By dusk, Flaxborough had adjusted once more not merely its accounts, but its assumptions. In the quiet of his office, Perbrite reflected briefly upon the subtle arithmetic of ambition. It rarely announces itself in grand sums. More often it advances by increments, justified by vision, concealed by civility. And in asking a single, deliberate question not of guilt, but of origin, he had uncovered the precise moment where principle yielded to pride. The town would soon convene again, this time not to speculate, but to decide. And Inspector Perbrite, patient custodian of both fact and temperament, prepared to observe that final balancing with the same quiet attention he had afforded the ledger itself. The parish council reconvened 3 evenings later in the same upper room of the town hall, though the air within it felt perceptibly altered. The damp chill remained, the bus shelter repainting a still-awaited decision, yet the undercurrent of uncertainty had been replaced by a more sober expectancy. Inspector Perbrite attended at the council's request, not as a prosecuting authority, but as a clarifying presence. Sergeant Love occupied a discreet position near the door, notebook in hand, though he sensed this would not be an evening of dramatic revelation. Mrs. Finch sat straighter than she had in days, the ledger before her once more. Reverend Pritchard appeared drawn, but composed. Councillor Stroud cleared his throat with habitual officiousness, though without the earlier certainty that had accompanied his assumptions. Miss Bellamy was present too. She had been released, pending the council's resolution, and her composure had returned in measured form. Pride had not deserted her entirely, but it had lost its earlier sheen. The chairman called the meeting to order, his gavel tapping with unnecessary firmness. "We are assembled," he began, "to receive Inspector Purbright's account of the recent irregularities." Perbrite rose without flourish. He did not consult notes. The sequence was already precise in his mind. "The discrepancy," he said calmly, "originated from incremental inflation of recorded expenses related primarily to floral and decorative arrangements for the harvest supper. The alterations were executed prior to transcription into the ledger, using Reverend Pritchard's pen to authenticate the entries." A murmur rippled faintly through the room, quickly subdued. "The total of these adjustments amounts to £142 and 8 shillings. The sum has been recovered in full." He paused, allowing arithmetic to settle before motive. "The intent, as stated, was to accumulate funds for parish improvements not yet formally sanctioned. No personal enrichment beyond the intended project has been identified." The phrasing was deliberate, neither accusatory nor exculpatory. Councillor Stroud shifted. "So the matter is clear." "The matter of funds is clear," Perbrite replied. "The matter of trust is less easily reconciled." Silence followed. All eyes turned inevitably toward Miss Bellamy. She rose without invitation. "I believed," she said evenly, "that the parish required decisive action." I accept that my method was improper. The admission lacked drama. It was neither defiant nor tearful. It bore, instead, the tone of someone who had rehearsed her reasoning and found it diminished. Mrs. Finch regarded her with an expression in which relief and injury were inseparable. Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat. "Clarissa, you might have sought consensus." "I did," she replied quietly, "and found none." The exchange, brief though it was, carried the weight of weeks of subtle rivalry. Perbrite observed without intervening. His role was not to arbitrate emotion, but to ensure sequence remained intact. After further deliberation, the council resolved upon formal censure and restitution without pursuing criminal prosecution, contingent upon Miss Bellamy's resignation from all financial oversight and committee leadership roles. The decision was neither harsh nor indulgent. It reflected Flaxborough's preference for correction over spectacle. When the resolution was recorded, Mrs. Finch closed the ledger with deliberate care. The sound of its cover meeting paper carried a quiet finality. As the meeting adjourned, small clusters formed murmured conversation, tentative reconciliation, discreet avoidance. The town had weathered the disturbance. It now sought equilibrium. Outside, the square lay under a thin veil of evening mist. Inspector Purbright descended the town hall steps beside Sergeant Love. "That was remarkably civil," Love said. "Civility," Perbrite replied, "is Flaxborough's preferred instrument. And justice? Justice," he said thoughtfully, "is often negotiated through it." They paused briefly as Mrs. Finch emerged, clutching the ledger like a restored heirloom. "Inspector," she said with composed gratitude, "you have preserved more than figures." Perbrite inclined his head. "You preserved them first." Miss Bellamy followed at a distance, her steps measured. The square offered no overt hostility, only the quiet recalibration of perception. She crossed it without pause this time, neither hurried nor triumphant. Sergeant Love watched her go. "Do you think she understands?" Perbrite considered the question. "She understands the arithmetic," he said. "Understanding the rest may take longer." They walked back toward the station as lamps flickered to life along the high street. Shopkeepers drew blinds. The bakery bell chimed one final time. Flaxborough resumed its habitual rhythm, though a subtle awareness lingered beneath its routines. Inside his office, Perbrite replaced the recovered receipts in their proper file and entered a final notation in the case record. His handwriting was neat, almost understated. When he finished, he closed the folder gently. The ledger, restored to balance, would continue its patient accounting. Yet the true adjustment lay not in pounds and shillings, but in the town's recognition that ambition, however well-intentioned, must answer to integrity. And with that measured conclusion, the inquiry approached its final reckoning, quiet, civil, and exact. The following Sunday, St. Barnabas appeared much, as it always had, modest stone warmed by hesitant sunlight, hymn numbers neatly adjusted, the congregation assembled in polite expectation. Yet beneath the familiar rituals lay the faintest awareness of recent recalculation. Mrs. Finch resumed her customary position near the vestry door, ledger secured beneath her arm with renewed, though quieter, authority. She greeted parishioners with measured composure. If there was triumph in her posture, it was carefully tempered by dignity. Miss Bellamy occupied a pew 3 rows from the front. Her presence did not provoke whispers. Flaxborough's discretion was rarely so crude. Instead, there existed a subtle recalibration of distance, neither ostracism nor warmth, but a courteous neutrality that signaled both memory and restraint. Inspector Perbrite attended the service without ostentation. He stood near the back, hat in hand, observing not devotion, but atmosphere. Reverend Pritchard's sermon, delivered with slightly more gravity than usual, concerned stewardship not of money, but of intention. Ambition, the vicar said gently from the pulpit, is not itself a vice, yet it must be tethered to patience. Several heads inclined in quiet recognition. After the service, the congregation filtered into the churchyard. Conversations resumed their accustomed topics: weather, garden yields, minor ailments, yet each exchange bore the faint residue of the previous week's events. The town had absorbed the disturbance. It now sought equilibrium not through denial, but through repetition of routine. Perbrite lingered near the gate as Mrs. Finch approached him. "The ledger balances," she said, her tone firm but not triumphant. "All sums accounted for." "I'm glad to hear it," he replied. She hesitated. "I have been less rigid this week." "Rigidity," he observed softly, "is sometimes a defense, and sometimes a provocation," she acknowledged. They shared a brief, almost conspiratorial understanding. Flaxborough's lessons were rarely singular. Across the yard, Miss Bellamy spoke quietly with Reverend Pritchard. Her expression had lost its former assertiveness. In its place stood something more reflective. Whether remorse or recalibration, it was not yet defined. Sergeant Love joined the inspector, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you think it's finished, sir?" he asked quietly. Perbrite considered the churchyard, the steady rhythm of departure, the reformation of familiar clusters, the soft hum of continuity. "In arithmetic," he said, "perhaps. And in people?" He allowed a faint smile. People rarely conclude so neatly. They walked slowly toward the high street. The bakery bell chimed. A cart rattled past. Curtains remained undisturbed. The town had resumed its habitual choreography. Later that afternoon, Perbrite returned to the station and retrieved the case file. He read through the final memorandum once more, ensuring its language remained measured. No flourish, no embellishment, merely fact, sequence, and resolution. He closed the file and placed it in the cabinet with deliberate care. Sergeant Love hovered near the doorway. "Sir, you never accused her outright." "There was no need," Perbrite replied. "The figures did that." "And the question?" Perbrite looked up mildly. "The question revealed the origin," Love clarified. "Origin is often more instructive than outcome," Perbrite said. Outside, the sun dipped lower over Flaxborough, casting elongated shadows across the square. The town hall windows reflected a town restored to composure. In her villa, Miss Bellamy sat at her piano for the first time in years and lifted the lid. The first notes were tentative, then steadier. Across the street, a neighbour paused, surprised but not displeased. In the vestry, Mrs. Finch entered a new line in the ledger. Balance confirmed. Her pen moved with customary precision, though she paused briefly before closing the book, as if acknowledging that numbers alone could not secure integrity. Reverend Pritchard drafted a modest proposal for future improvements, this time to be presented openly, debated patiently. Flaxborough had not been undone by scandal. It had merely been reminded that even small adjustments carry weight. As evening settled, Inspector Purbright locked his office and stepped into the cooling air. The high street lay calm, lamps glowing with habitual restraint. He paused for a moment, listening not for disturbance but for the reassuring absence of it. The Parish Ledger rested once more in its cupboard, reconciled and quiet. Yet its recent imbalance would linger in memory as a gentle caution against the arithmetic of pride. Perbrite turned toward home, his pace unhurried. In Flaxborough, resolution seldom arrived with spectacle. It arrived instead through steady attention, civil confrontation, and the quiet insistence that integrity, however understated, must balance the books. And in that balance, precise, patient, and finally restored, the town resumed its life, altered only by the knowledge that even the smallest figures deserve honest reckoning.